So I was looking through the work of some of my favorite photographers again recently and doing a little bit of introspection on my own work, and this question came to mind that's come to mind so many times before. The question is, what is adventure photography? And the reason this question keeps coming to mind is because, quite frankly, there's not a really good answer. I've watched so many YouTube videos, I've read books, I've looked at Instagram posts, I've talked to other photographers, and no matter who you ask, it seems to mean something different. So for my own sanity, I kind of put together this little definition, and that's that adventure photography, it's really the immediacy of shots, it's the urgency of moments, and it's the desire to put oneself into fleeting, vulnerable environments that really leave you very little time and comfort to create. All right, then so how do we categorize adventure photography? I mean, honestly, I actually think we shouldn't. I think adventure photography is something that should stay looser than that. It's not really clearly any single genre in and of itself. I mean, okay, for example, I think a wildlife photographer that's tracking cheetahs through the Kenyan bush, they're absolutely doing adventure photography. A journalist who's on the front lines documenting, human conflict, I think in a sense that's adventure photography. I even think a landscape photographer in the far reaches of Yemen, seeking out the famed Socotra tree. In so many ways, that is adventure photography. So then, I mean, how could I possibly be making this video? I mean, how could there be tips on how to get better at something that could be, tracking animals, that could be frontline journalism, that could be landscape photography or astrophotography? How could there be any single set of tips that actually, speaks to all of these genres effectively? And I think you'll find that some of these really do work universally. They're inherently going to be somewhat broad, but I think that's exactly what's good about adventure photography. Okay, so with all that in mind, here's tip number one. Let's rethink the exposure triangle. We're taught to find this optimal range of aperture and shutter speed to keep our ISO as low as possible, and that is the healthiest approach to the exposure triangle. I think we're missing all kinds of artistic opportunity when we confine ourselves to this very simple representation of the exposure triangle. Considering things like using higher ISOs, slower shutter speeds, or tighter apertures, they're all counterintuitive to the perfect exposure triangle, but from a style perspective and from the opportunity to shoot that may come as a result of rethinking each of these variables, I think it's really, really worth it. I mean, high ISO, it's something we are taught to avoid like the plague, but the truth is, it adds a lot of character. There's grain patterns in modern cameras can be so pleasing, and ultimately we might be building in a little bit more story. If a photo should speak to the fact that it's nighttime or morning. And then slow shutter speeds. Well, a lot of times if we're thinking of adventure photography as being this fleeting, vulnerable thing, there's going to be an introduction of motion. And so a slower shutter speed is our chance to tell the story. It's our chance to look at somebody moving along, look at a tree blowing in the wind, an animal jumping, whatever it may be. Using that slower shutter speed, we can really capture the essence of that movement. And then that allows us to rethink the other aspects of the exposure triangle. Finally, we can get into a tighter aperture. Maybe we're creating a much broader depth of field so that we can bring lots of elements into focus. We may have to have a higher ISO as a result or a lower shutter speed, but we also might be able to tell this more complete picture of everything that's going on. So I guess all I'm trying to say is play around with the exposure triangle. Don't look at it as some strict set of rules, because each of these things should be manipulated. They should be altered to represent your style and to ultimately give you more opportunities to take photos in these high-paced settings. Okay, on to tip number two, and that is to start thinking about building photo series. I think this day and age, especially with the age of instant gratification through social media, we're often looking for the hero shot, the glory shot. We're looking for the one photo that we think is the most compelling, brings everything together, the most beautiful. And I think it's missing an opportunity, especially when we're considering adventure photography where things may be fleeting, there may be vulnerability or urgency, there may be different variables interacting at such a pace that I think the most effective way for us to tell that story is through a sequence of photos. Now, go ahead and argue with me in the comments, because I think if you were to say that there are people out there that can take a single photo and tell a brilliant story, yeah, sure, there are some pretty good exceptions out there. But generally speaking, if we start thinking about what we're producing as a series rather than a single glory shot, for one, we free ourselves up to think about more elements of the scene, more moments, a more continuous timeline rather than a single, high stress photo. All right, that puts us on tip number 3. And this one is to find new perspectives. Now, this tip really ties in well with the last video I put out just about staying mobile, because the idea of finding new perspectives, it's very literal. It's getting back and above and looking down on people. It's bringing yourself down onto the ground and considering the cracks and the grass and the moss. It's looking from a mile away and compressing a scene together, or from the branches of a tree looking down on people passing by. Whatever it may be, finding new perspectives is like, where do you want the viewer to feel like they're looking at the photos from? You're deciding for them where they exist in this little story that you're telling. So finding new perspectives, especially unique ones, maybe ones that aren't so obvious, this is your chance to really immerse somebody who's looking at your photos and to make it a more compelling experience for them. Ultimately, if that's more compelling for them, it's gonna be more memorable for them, and that can do nothing but help you. Next up is tip number 4, and this one's, I think, a really, really fun one. This one is to use the weather to your advantage, especially in adventure photography where we have these fleeting, urgent moments and oftentimes situations that cannot be repeated. We're stuck with the weather we've got, and so using it to our advantage means bringing it into the story. Let it be a part of what makes your photography compelling. A lot of people get upset when they go out and they have this vision of a scene, and then maybe it's rainy. Well, that rain is part of the story. The raindrops on your lens element, the clouds passing by, maybe the gray contours of a storm cloud rising in the scene, whatever it may be. Wind, you've got the blowing grass, you've got the blowing branches. Use those lower shutter speeds like I was talking about in tip number 2. Using weather to your advantage is like adding this natural element of style. It actually helps tell the story very naturally for you. And I think, we oftentimes fight what's right there in front of us. So stop fighting it. Start using it to your advantage. It's tip number 4. Okay, last up, we have tip number 5. And tip number 5 is almost like the perfect culmination of the prior 4 tips, because in some ways it includes each of them. Tip number 5 is simply put just to keep an open mind. If you go into an environment with a static mindset, you're gonna come out with static photos. Take what's given to you. This means, yes, the weather, but it also means the story changing from what you expected it to be. The scene changing, the light changing, all these different things, they can either be pros or they can be cons, but ultimately they are a part of the story. And if you keep an open mind and allow yourself to see things for what it is rather than what you expected it to be, you give yourself the chance to really effectively work with the elements in front of you. Okay guys, it's time to close this one up with just a few final thoughts. I have always been drawn to adventure photography, and I think it's because its fleeting nature suits my impatient brain. I find that there's very little opportunity to repeat other people or even myself, and it's very hard to copy or be copied in this genre. It's such an organic space full of so much life, energy, and opportunity, all equally contrasted by misfortune and stress and struggle. The beauty of adventure photography is that there's no right way to do it. You just can't box it in. But I still make this video because a few years ago when I was getting started, there was some information that I wish I had learned, some ways to do it better. And I hope this video can help someone like past versions of me trying to find some of that information. If this video was helpful to you, let me know in the comments below. Let me know which part of it. If you disagree with anything, again, please let me know down below. There's no firm rules, and I don't believe I'm objectively right or any of these things are certain truths, but these are just some of the lessons I've learned, and I think these tips, I actually do think they can make a more compelling photographer out of an adventure photographer. Anyway, I really appreciate you guys' time. I'm stoked to make another one of these, and I'll see you guys next week. Bye.